Hello and welcome to Knit Pickers PEI in beautiful downtown Mayfield, just a little bit south of Cavendish, Prince Edward Island, and a little bit west of North Rustico. Today's video is going to cover the necessity of doing a sample swatch. I know. Lots of people say, oh, why do I need to bother doing a swatch? It's just using up extra yarn and it's using up extra time. Well, let's say you're making a sweater and the pattern calls for 16 stitches and 24 rows to a 4-inch square. And you just decide, I'm going to knit the sweater and I'm not going to do a sample swatch. Well, what happens is, depending on the size of the needle you're using, the pattern might say use a 6mm needle, but if you're a tight knitter or you're a looser knitter, you could end up with a sweater that fits you like a sausage, or you could end up with a sweater that is so big and baggy that you just don't want to appear in public in it. So what I did is I knit 3 sample swatches for a sweater that I'm working on. Now, when you knit a sample swatch, you always want it to be a little bit bigger than what the pattern is saying. What I mean is, if the pattern says it's 16 stitches and 24 rows to a 4-inch square, you don't want to knit exactly 16 stitches and exactly 24 rows for your sample swatch. You might want to knit about 24 stitches and maybe 32 rows. That's going to give you a much more accurate sample swatch. So here you see my sample swatches. Using the same wool, of course, I used a 4mm needle, a 5mm needle, and a 6mm needle. Now the difference really was quite astounding. With the 4mm needle on a 4-inch square, I ended up with 24 stitches to 4 inches and 26 rows to 4 inches. On the 6mm needle, I ended up with only 18 stitches and 23 rows to a 4-inch square. So you can imagine the difference. In 4 inches, you're talking a difference of 6 stitches every 4 inches. That's going to make quite a substantial difference if you're making a sweater. The other thing you're looking at is drape and texture. So what I found when I knit my sample swatch, using the 4mm needles, was a little bit too firm for what I wanted to see with a sweater. It might be good for socks, but not so great for a sweater. With the 6mm needles, it was too drapey, too loose. I didn't feel that it would hold its body well. The 5mm needle was the texture, was the drape that I wanted to see if I was going to be knitting a sweater. The final reason that you will want to do a sample swatch is, even if you've used the same wool before, the same weight of wool before, the same brand of wool before, but the last time you knit it using, let's just say you knit natural white, and this time you want to knit using a red. Well, the natural white wool has not absorbed any dye. You will often find that a red skein of wool will be denser. It will actually weigh a little bit more than the same skein of wool in white, the same length in the skein, the same yardage in the skein, but the red is going to weigh more because it has taken up that dye. So depending on the color you're knitting, it can make a difference in whether or not your swatch is going to be the same. So it's definitely worth the time to do a sample swatch. So even though you've used the same wool before, maybe this time you're using a different color, always take the time to do a sample swatch. Knitting a sweater is a lengthy process. and you don't want to waste that time creating the perfect sweater that you thought was going to be for you, and it's going to end up being for somebody else because it doesn't fit right. The other thing is, with your sample swatch, you always want to make sure that you wash it and block it before you take your measurements, because you're going to be washing and blocking your sweater. So you want to make sure that that's going to match up. And that is why it's important to do a sample swatch. I hope you learned a little something today, and happy knitting.